The deeper you go into One Piece, the less it feels like a simple pirate adventure. There are mysteries that have remained unsolved for decades, connections that shouldn't exist, and theories so unsettling they change the way you see the entire backstory. This part of the Theory Iceberg is looking at some of the ideas that land on the deeper side, while still maintaining some decent evidence and thematic resonance with Oda's whole message. These include whether Smoker or Kuzan will take over Sword in the future, and whether they'll fight the Marines in the final war. We discuss whether Kobe will fight against Akainu in Akainu's last battle, whether Blackbeard's fruit is actually Imu's weakness, or perhaps particularly effective against the Holy Knights, whether or not fishmen were made by humans, and if Imu is actually a vampire. So that's just a few examples of what we're going to be talking about, so make sure you're subbed, and without further ado, I'm going to get straight into it. So we start light with the idea that Caribou is the son of Ochoku, and that Blackbeard actually knows this. It goes towards the deeper end of the iceberg because we haven't had anything explicit, but we can draw connections from scenes where Oda's intentionally hinted at a relationship between these people. So Ochoku, or Wangji, is a former rocks pirate, later associated with Hachinosu. Caribou possesses knowledge of ancient weapons and attempts to sell that information to powerful figures. Although we're not exactly sure whether or not it's just Blackbeard Caribou was getting the information for, or if it's a lie and there's something else going on. But this does jive with the fact that Ochoku snitched on the treasure of Hachinosu, or the crown jewel as some people called it, which was Shaki. So in the same way Shaki was given over by Ochoku, it looks like the ancient weapons are going to be given over by Caribou. Now, where it gets more interesting is Caribou gave food to the Straw Hats, right? And we know that that is significant when it comes to Luffy and his alliances. So if Blackbeard was to extract the information of the ancient weapons out and then either unalive or harm Caribou afterwards, it might be another trigger, just like Ace would be, right? For Luffy to essentially step in and start fighting with Blackbeard. I like the idea because Caribou does seem like an ambiguous character. However, there are rules in One Piece, and those who share food with Luffy do abide by a certain rule, which is that they are on his team, or Luffy will protect them. It's symbolic throughout the story, and it's recurring throughout many arcs. For example, think about Wano, right? So this could be a really unassuming catalyst for Luffy and Blackbeard battling. Another deep theory, and this one's very specific, is that Luffy's final attack will be fire-based. There's all sorts of ideas around fire-based attacks. One of the most overlooked ones is probably the fact that Sabo used a fire punch to attack Emu, and Emu ate it as a dragon. It wouldn't surprise me at all if once the Holy Knights, or like the Horcrux element to Emu, is destroyed and Emu becomes vulnerable, we'll see a very similar attack, either from the Mirror and Sabo, or from Luffy with his Red Rock, but this time it'll actually affect Emu. This also plays into the idea some fans have discussed around Ragnia, which is Loki's attack, being used alongside Red Rock, which is Luffy's attack, and together they make Ragnia Rock, a mixture of fire and ice, which would be absolutely perfect and fits completely in the motifs of One Piece. However, it's not guaranteed because Oda isn't always so on the nose with these things. He talks often in interviews about how he's always battling pace, you know, he's always trying to move the story quick enough so he can get to the destination, which means we lose out on a load of extra lore, even though he's already written it in notes, etc. This is particularly prevalent in Wano with Zoro, where Zoro really didn't get the glow up we expected, just like Franky and Egghead, but Zoro was the one that we know Oda had notes for, but did not include them in the end. There's some other interesting attacks that Luffy has as well, like Golden Rifle, which he uses against Enel, and it evokes sun imagery, which fits with Luffy's role as a liberator. So maybe the coming together of the fire and the ice, or something like that, creates some sort of sun-moon attack, which just obliterates Emu. We can be confident that fire does play an important role, right? Think about Usopp burning the world government flag, Robin being the flame of rebellion, Sabo being the flame of revolution. Fire is connected with the changing of times, right? So it's more than likely that Emu at one point will burn, and that'll be the end. We saw images around this at the time of Luffy's Gear 5 transformation, which was contrasted by Orochi, who was burning in a barn as he already played the Moon Princess song. So it's going to be another example of that, pretty much. And then presumably after that is when the flooding happens that Vegapunk referred to. Now let's sink our teeth into something a bit more spicy, which is a theory that no one's brought up yet, but it's the idea that Emu's reveal showed us that Emu is actually a giant. This is most highlighted when Emu fights Zoro briefly, and it opens a very important question, which is that Emu may be mixed race. So Emu is shown to be Lunarian. The only other Lunarian we've seen is King. King is not particularly tall compared to people like Big Mom and Kaido, whereas Emu seems a little bit taller, if not the same height as these two. So why is Emu a Lunarian giant? Now this really adds some interesting interesting depth to Emu, because after the reveal, I presume that Emu was straight up a Lunarian. A lot of other readers speculated that Emu stole Lunarian powers, but the point I'm making is it's up for contention. There's nothing set in stone at the moment. There's no direct true history that tells us what Emu's relationship is with Lunarians. Now, where it gets deeper is the fact that Emu is a giant Lunarian, and Emu is the head of the world government, a faction that is known to try to recreate giants. So, this presents us with a couple of possibilities. Did Emu opt to turn themselves into a giant / Lunarian? Is Emu a Lunarian that turned into a giant, or a giant that turned into a Lunarian? Or the one that I think is most likely is, were the experiments that are being performed by the world government today on mixed races being performed centuries ago by the ancient kingdom on Emu? This would explain why Emu is so driven to have Caesar create giants, for example, or smile fruits to be made, which is another artificial example of harnessing power. But I can guarantee you it's not an insignificant detail. It's super important and no one is discussing it at the moment. So rather than get into the nitty-gritty and start providing evidence, what I would speculate is that Emu was Lunarian by birth. Because of Emu's durable body, which Queen explains to Sanji in the Wano arc, the ancient kingdom used Emu when Emu was a child to experiment on and try to turn into a war machine, essentially. We see this evoked through the battle Frankies with Franky's character and his progression all the way up to building the Sunny. And we see the idea encapsulated in a couple other aspects of the Straw Hats and the story as a whole. The final question it leaves us with is, what else has Emu got going on that we can't see? There's obviously all these lines and polka dots, etc., which does imply that there's more going on to Emu, that we're gonna see more. But what I'm most interested in is, does Emu have a connection to the Three-Eyed Tribe or any exotic races like that? What other inherent abilities does Emu have? Does Emu have the voice of all things? And I'm confident that Oda's going to give us some information regarding this and reveal bit by bit what makes Emu up. In summary, Emu is probably originally a Lunarian prince that was taken by the ancient kingdom and then turned into a homogeny of all sorts of mixed races and experimentation, to the point where Emu's borderline no longer Emu and is now Mu. Moving on, let's discuss the fishmen and how they were created. Did someone from the ancient kingdom, potentially someone with Vegapunk's fruit, bioengineer the fishmen from humans in an attempt to survive the rising sea levels? Fishmen are extremely strong, so it suggests they're potentially crossed with Sea King lineage or some sort of sea beast lineage. And this, if you follow this path, it will take you all the way to Poseidon. When we look at the rough time frame that Poseidon takes to respawn, it matches with the lifespan of a Sea King. So perhaps mermaids mixed with Sea Kings give you giant mermaid Poseidons like Shirahoshi, and if you mix Sea King lineage with humans or impregnate a human with Sea King lineage, then I believe you're going to start getting crossbreeds, ergo the fishmen. Now, there's a couple of significant things to note here. Firstly, if the world government was responsible for this, then again it acts as another juxtaposition with the whole world government hating exotic races, yet creating exotic races. And that leads us to the next thing, which is, why would the world government create fishmen? Well, we know sea levels rose, and we know slavery and slavery of fishmen is a very big topic in One Piece. So it could be that the species was either created to do the labor for the world government during the rising tides. Best example here is probably the 4 bridges that were being built. You know, Tequila Wolf wasn't shown to be built by fishmen, but there's 3 other bridges and other structures in the sea, so it's likely that they were built by fishmen and mermaids. The lack of world government presence down at Fishman Island does suggest that the fishmen were eventually able to break away, whether or not that be through their own breeding or whatever. They were likely liberated down to the bottom of the ocean where they could hide. This plays into the whole idea of Joy Boy's promise being take Fishman Island into the sun. And notably, during the arc, Oda did explicitly show us how fishmen genetics are passed down. Throughout the Fishman Island arc, a recurring motif is hate towards humanity, which does add weight to this idea that humans are the natural enemies of the fishmen, you know, because they create them as slaves. And I guess the biggest clue to it all is the fact they're called fishmen, right? Fish and men. This leads me to discuss another idea as well, that fishmen or Sea Kings have a particular strength over enemies such as the Holy Knights. Now that might not make sense at first, but I'll explain. Obviously Shanks had his arm ripped off by a Sea King. That arm did not grow back. So does the Lord of the Coast have the ability to remove the regeneration of the Holy Knights? Something that plays in here is a parallel that was dropped early in Elbaf, where Jinbei and Nami discussed how Jinbei was trying to find a solution to defeat the Holy Knights. During the same chapter, there was one one panel that paralleled an old panel from Fishman Island, which was discussing Fishman karate. Raizo in Wano released water from a scroll he collected earlier in the story, and Jinbei used Fishman karate to bend the currents. So the idea that I'm talking about here is that if the sea level rising is a threat to the world government and the Celestials, which does seem to be the case now, we know that they fear rain the most, then it could be that Fishmen karate, fishmen, and just water in general is particularly potent against Holy Knights. After all, when you consider what the Holy Knights are, how they're kind of royal, high-class, pure-blood individuals, it's a really nice fit that fishmen, these oppressed, weaker race created by the higher class, happen to be the key to quickly defeating them. This next theory talks about Akainu's final opponent being Kobe. Kobe's arc started with standing up to corrupt Marines. During Marineford, he was willing to stand up to Akainu in order to save Marine lives. Kobe and Akainu have opposing views of what the Marines represent. Kobe is referred to by Garp as the future of the Marines. Akainu gained his current title by beating out Garp's previous disciple, right? Like, so Punk Hazard, Akainu fought Kuzan, and we now know that Kuzan was trained by Garp. As such, it's likely that Garp's current pupil, or the one that he's just, moved on from, Kobe, will be the one to defeat Akainu. I already mentioned that Kobe met Akainu during Marineford and stood up to him. And Marineford's significant in One Piece because it acts as a center point. So I'll give you an example. We met Crocus at the beginning of the Grand Line with Laboon. We met Rayleigh in the middle of the Grand Line in Sabaody, and then we met Scopper at the end of the Grand Line in Elbaf, right? So there's this pattern here, and that pattern suggests that Akainu and Kobe will meet again. If this is the case, we might get some extra lore about Garp and Akainu's relationship and their past together, which is more significant than you might think because Akainu is highly tied to Dragon, Monkey Dragon, their ages, etc. And of course, Dragon is Garp's son. So it might be that Akainu and Dragon at one point were mentored by Garp or something along them lines, but keep an eye out for that. This takes us into the more niche idea as well, that Smoker and Kuzan seem to have a position upcoming in Sword or the Navy or the world government in general. So what do we mean by this? Well, Smoker inherently seems to be a good dude. He's got his own form of justice, which evokes the whole situation with Sword, and also there's a ton of mystery surrounding him. Also, we have Kuzan, who defected from the world government. We don't know why. I personally believe it's because Imu asked Kuzan to keep the freezer cold, and Kuzan realized what was going on and said no, and so fled. However, we have no idea currently, and that is just speculation. Either way, a lot of readers believe that Kuzan will betray Blackbeard pirates, or that he isn't completely a part of Blackbeard's agenda or supporting of it. And we also know that Kuzan and Smoker have a strangely personal relationship. If you remember when Smoker got defeated by Dofi, it was Kuzan that came and saved him. And Aikichi told Smoker, I am still the old me, right? So this really adds to this idea that Kuzan has a hidden agenda going on. One way this could all resolve is that Kuzan has a secret agenda where it's full of betrayal and lies, but it gets him back to where he needs to be, which is the good side of the story, so a protagonist. Whereas Smoker wears his heart on his sleeve and just tries to do what's right. So these two opposites might come together to replace Garp as their head of Sword and reform the Navy. Then in the final war, this great power will be used against the world government, which is a good way for Oda to avoid thousands of semi-innocent people from being absolutely obliterated. Kobe's another candidate we could talk about for leading a new world government Navy faction. However, the fact Kobe is so tightly connected to Garp does suggest to me that Kobe's going to be doing his own thing. Now, one little detail I wanted to add is to just highlight quickly how ridiculous Sword is as a faction. I'm not Oda, so I don't know this for sure, but it seems to me that the idea of Sword is a massive Deus Ex, because how can you have a military faction that, under contract just does its own thing and everyone's okay with that? That's just never going to be the case. So it might have been that Oda wrote himself into a corner with Sword, and it was supposed to be a secret faction at first, but it just grew out of control. So now it's more of a public faction where people are, oh yeah, Garp can do what he wants. It's just not in line with the world government and their totalitarian rule. It doesn't really work. So unless Oda does have a big reveal for this, I think it is a bit of an ass pull, but it can lead us to a situation where Sword gets taken over and then becomes dominant of the Navy below it and just flips that entire side against the world government. A really cool theory is the connections between Love Sickness, Emu, and Lily, or the island of Amazon Lily. There's a really frequent recurring motif in One Piece, which is portraits of women, all of whom have died. So we have Carmel, we have Lily, we have Sanji's mum, we have a photo of a woman on the St. Brice with a hole in her head. We have Ginny, we have Sindri, and we have Riku's wife, just to name a few. But what has that got to do with love sickness? Well, there seems to be this idea around preserving having a female and their image and their likeness in One Piece. Now with the massive portrait of Lily, which incidentally could be a photo, by the way. Sindri's was said to be a photo. So Lily, the big painting of Lily could also be a photo. But we now know that's why Oda's leaving these breadcrumbs, right? It's because it all trails back to what happened with Lily. Now, the person that was looking at the painting of Lily was Imu. So there's a connection between the two of them. Another detail that plays into all these portraits of dead women is sickness. So Ginny got sick. We just saw that Candle got sick. Sanji's mum got sick, and so on and so on. Evoking this idea that there's something going on with Lily, Imu, and sickness. So just as it kind of is implied softly that Ginny was made sick by the world government experiments, Lily is likely been made sick by Imu. Okay, so what's that got to do with the modern story? Well, there is an island called Amazon Lily, which shares Lily in its name. This island happens to have a very lethal disease called love sickness. Thirdly, the island is completely full of women. So it seems so far, everything's pointing in this direction. Now, men are not allowed on the island, despite the love sickness situation, which creates this juxtaposition, although it's not highlighted by Oda. Instead, it's kept kind of separate and subtle during the Amazon Lily arc. So one option is that Imu discovered Lily's blunder, discussed between Imu and Cobra later on in the story, and as such, Lily fled into exile. Now, the island Lily then founded is Amazon Lily, and Lily later goes on to die from the love sickness. This is alluded to by Gloriosa when she talks about Tritoma, which is the previous empress that is worshipped because she stayed on the island and died of love sickness. If you leave the island to cure yourself, you're shunned by the community. Up until Boa did it. Now everything's all good, and obviously it doesn't apply because that would be inconvenient to the story, Oda. But you get what I'm saying. So the pattern of females, portraits, and sickness is shared not only by Lily, but also at Amazon Lily, giving us a strong connection between the two. All the females on Amazon Lily are named after flowers, just like Lily, and the most beautiful woman becomes the captain and the empress of the nation. Something that's also recurring throughout all these female characters I discussed is their reputation for beauty. Candle is known for it, Sindri is known for it, etc, etc. But the point being is Lily was likely the head of the Kuja tribe, the captain of the Kuja pirates, and the founder of Amazon Lily, all within a short space of time before she died. It could be this exact sickness which brings about this whole relationship between Joy Boy and the Opie Nomi, because Joy Boy might have performed the immortal surgery on Lily or Imu to save them from their love sickness, which brings me to the other part of this idea. If Lily has love sickness, it means Imu does too. If Lily dies and Emu's immortal, then that tells us that Emu is probably going to be hindered by love sickness forever, indefinitely, because there's no Lily. So imagine having love sickness but never being able to die, nor never being able to reconvene with the person that you love. This creates a perpetual hell and kind of like an in-between state between life and death, which fits Emu's elements perfectly and would play really well into this idea that Joy Boy could have used the surgery to free Emu from this situation if they were, say, brothers or something like that, right? Because Emu might be a massive dick, but Joy Boy probably wasn't. Joy Boy probably sacrificed himself to benefit Emu in some way, you know? I really like the topic of Amazon Lily and how that all plays into it. A real abstract theory that would go deep in the Iceberg is all about how Jaya ties to Joy Boy and could be where Joy Boy started or where he was born. So firstly, it's important to note that the word Jaya, the name of the island, comes from Jaya Baya, which is one of the big inspirations for Joy Boy. So immediately the two are inherently connected. There's a place called Southgrave, which I've long speculated could be where Joy Boy's body is buried, but this is the one that I really like the most. Jaya at first was not shown as an entire map. It was shown in parts. When the parts are put together, it shows us a skull. What island came previous to this? Long Ring Longland, which is in the shape of a crown. If Joy Boy was the pirate king, then having Long Ring Longland as a crown on top of the Jaya skull would create a massive Jolly Roger Island. This is unlikely to be in-world, and instead is more of a macro detail that Oda's included, but I definitely do not believe this is a coincidence. I think that Long Ring Longland, as well as other islands, were a part of Jaya, and Jaya was the center of it. I believe it's where Joy Boy probably learned of the tales of Joy Boy or Nika and became inspired to travel, which is why we see the Straw Hats go from Jaya into the heavens, right, into the sky. They go up on this big adventure, and Nika is inherently connected to the Sky Island. I'll try and include a picture on the screen of what I mean by the design of the islands and how they come together to make a Pirate King island. And there's other little details. For example, Mock Town is there, right? Mock is a word for joking, so Joke Town, Joy Boy, it all seems to fit. Next, let's talk about the connections between Perona and Nerona, Emu and Mihawk, which makes Imhawk when you flip the prefix backwards. What's going on with Gloom Kingdom? So first things first, Kurigana Island and the kingdom was home to a war with the human drills, and the people there were wiped out. So there's already some inherent mystery baked into the location. But what's this got to do with Emu? Well, it is still quite vague. I found it hard to piece everything together. But what we do know is Emu is fundamentally connected to vampires and blood. Around chapter 1000, there was some old designs released by Oda, and we got a lot of like vampiric and werewolf vibes. So we know it was on Oda's mind back in the day. Lalesia, Stussy, a couple of people in Wano, and a few other examples show that vampires are recurring in One Piece. We also know blood's significant, whether or not that be the way Luffy pumps blood around his body for Gear Second, or the human blood that Fisher Tiger rejected for transfusion, which was later then settled by Luffy taking a blood transfusion from Jinbei. So vampires and blood do play a role. A detail that might come into this is the fact that Mihawk is absolutely littered in crosses. Yoru isn't explicitly stated to be a cursed blade, so we're not too sure what all this is about even to this day. Interestingly, if Oda is leaning into vampire elements, then this could be why the Gorosei were so reluctant to allow Emu to lead. Perhaps the light in Marijois is, artificial or not pure sunlight, and by leaving Marijois, Emu becomes exposed, thus coughing the blood that we saw. Now, I could go down the rabbit hole and just get into more and more examples, but there are videos and posts out there that you can check out. The reason why I think it's so interesting to bring up is just one very small concept. There's this idea with vampires that they cannot come in unless they're invited. I don't know how that pertains specifically to One Piece, but it does make me think of Domi Reversi and some of the little nuances that have been discussed by the fanbase with the Holy Knights and with Domi Reversi, stuff like that, because there does seem to be a rule to it. So maybe there needs to be a part of you that invites Emu in. Maybe you need to be in pain or fear or something like that. We do know that fear plays a role around Mihawk and Perona. For example, Usopp beat Perona by scaring her. It's not the only time this has happened. Chopper beat Kumadori by scaring him too. But as I say, if you want the connections between Emu and vampirism and blood, then go look them up online because there's tons. The reason why I bring it up today though is more so to think about what this could mean, where this is going, what are the rules that pertain to Emu that also pertain to vampires. Before I move off the topic of Mihawk, there's a little bonus theory I wanted to add, which carries some good weight and is definitely underrated in the community, I believe. The theory is pretty simple. It's the idea that Mihawk is actually from Amazon Lily. Now, straight away, some people are going to be rolling their eyes thinking, no, that's not the case. But equally, we can counter that by saying, look at Shaki's hair, look at Rayleigh's beard. Shaki and Rayleigh are known to have a relationship, and Mihawk's design, including the floral patterns on his clothes, match Rayleigh and Shaki perfectly. When you think about the fact that Shaki left Amazon Lily to be with Rayleigh, even though Rayleigh's out in an open relationship, getting on with other women, the real reason might be because of the fact she was pregnant. Now, Makino has a whole secret pregnancy and marriage with Shanks through the cover pages, and Makino owns a bar, just like Shaki owns the Spider's Cafe. So there is tons of small details, which, while this theory stays in the deeper side and may never be confirmed, definitely suggests that Shaki and Rayleigh had a baby, and that baby is Mihawk. This would make Mihawk the only male ever to be born on Amazon Lily as far as we know, which could tie into the fact that he's such a legendary swordsman, or just his whole demeanor. Now, following the pattern, let's look at another super deep theory that most people don't know or talk about, although it seems pretty explicitly true, or at least plays a role in the true history, which is, did the ancient kingdom summon a sea devil? So in an SBS in chapter 854, someone asked, what is a heart full of belief? Oda answers, it could be, for example, the strength of mind, not to be led astray by the deceptive lies of adults who cannot admit their own mistakes. So this tells us the ancient kingdom's downfall was caused by the deception and mistakes of those in charge. This means that in order to avoid the mistakes the ancient kingdom made, a person must be true to themselves and, show some humility, admit their mistake. If people aren't true to themselves, it perpetuates a curse, told to the reader when Neptune says that traditions that overstay their welcomes become curses. And the idea of being cursed and thus overstaying your welcome is touched on throughout the story, for example, with the Gorosei, who are now like yokai. Or for example, with Vanderdecken, who travelled under the ocean, but then was cursed to live forever under the sea, aka overstaying his welcome. And and generally it's a recurring motif in the story. Now, the curse that the Ancient Kingdom bestowed upon the world is hinted to actually be Emu, when Roger says a child is not responsible for the sins of the parents. There's evidence from Judge that Emu was sacrificed in some way for the Ancient Kingdom in the quote, "Are you my sacrifice, Sanji?" So he's, of course, Judge is talking to his child there, indicating that the Ancient Kingdom saw Emu as a sacrifice, or Emu's parents saw him as a sacrifice. A child says to Bonnie in 1097 that she's a vampire and can't come into the light, potentially telling us that Emu cannot go into sunlight because of whatever the Ancient Kingdom did to Emu. I've touched on this before when I spoke about Emu leaving Marijmar and coughing up blood, and Oda was very comfortable with the Gorosei explicitly telling the reader that they were aware that there's a downside to Emu leaving Marijmar, or maybe specifically Pangaea Castle. So perhaps the same way Xebec is evoking Davy, and the way Roger evoked Joy Boy, the Ancient Kingdom might have been trying to use Emu as a conduit to evoke something, or someone, such as the Sun God or the Sea God. This would explain why Emu addresses Mu in third person, because Emu's body is possessed by someone that isn't Emu. This is foreshadowed by the people on Namakura Island trying to summon death with a summoning circle that resembles the ones Emu used. From this we can infer the Ancient Kingdom were trying to make a deal with death. Considering the recurring references to devils, it's probably specifically the devil that the Ancient Kingdom were trying to summon. In chapter 1099, Kuma says, "I would make a deal with you to save Bonnie's life, even if you were the devil," reinforcing this idea. A deal with the devil would be for unnatural powers, illustrated by the special abilities in the series being called devil fruits, right? Oda confirms devil fruit users are weakened by the sea in an SBS. He says that any body of water will weaken a devil fruit user because all water on the planet is essentially seawater in the bigger picture. So it seems the Ancient Kingdom were trying to summon the sea devil specifically. Now, Caesar tells us the cost of this deal is a heart, saying, "Give your heart to me and our deal will be sealed." In chapter 858, Caesar says to Luffy, "My only escape from certain death was this guy taking control of my heart and making me his slave." So this could be figurative or it could be literal, like Davy Jones' heart in Pirates of the Caribbean, which is kept in a chest. In Hiruluk's speech, he suggests losing your heart doesn't kill a person, saying, "When does someone die? When their heart stops? No." Of course, we hear a similar motif with Hiruluk, who saw somebody cure a sickness of the heart in like a miraculous way in the West Blue. Now, we have seen people survive without hearts in their chests before, for example in Punk Hazard when the Straw Hats have their hearts switched. Additionally, this causes their personalities to switch, telling us that because the Sea Devil possessed Emu's heart, Emu may have taken on its personality. Now, interestingly, Kuma says in 1097 that if pain is left untouched, it goes back to the original source or the original person. So maybe the pain in Emu's heart is this devil or demon they summoned, and it's inside Emu, and for Emu to be relieved of that pain, it needs to be extracted. You know, the devil needs to be taken out of Emu. Now, the most important evidence for this, I should have probably included earlier, but is the fact that we've seen two deals with the devil made, one in the sky and one on the earth. The one in the sky featured the sacrifice of a young girl to the sun god in order for the village to be saved, which is highlighted by the fact that the sacrifice herself says if her life can be given to make the rest of the villagers okay and happy, then she's more than happy to give her life away. Now, this is contrasted by the sacrifice at Namakura Island, which featured Brook. After Kuma hit him and he got diverted to this summoning circle, we see a priest and lots of other priests offering blood and soul in order for their dreams to be fulfilled. If we mash these two together, we get this idea that the Ancient Kingdom was trying to summon the sun god so its dreams can be fulfilled. If you're familiar with deeper One Piece theories, particularly like mine on Dendenkushi, you'll know pretty quickly that this is a reference to the eternal flame, right? The eternal flame can make an artificial sun and is connect the sun god, but the eternal flame is also a significant power source which allows dreams to become reality, which we've seen manifested through devil fruits, giant mech robots, high-tech advanced technology, stuff like that. So in summary, it would seem that either the Ancient Kingdom or maybe someone prior to that has had some communion with the Sea Devil. This could be Davy Jones, this could be someone else. And we're speculating that that Sea Devil or its essence was taken and imbued into Emu. So Emu is like a Klabauterman of the sea almost. Now, this gets real confusing when we think about the fact Emu has a devil fruit power, but because of the devil fruit powers of the Gorosei and the fact that they don't seem to be from fruits, similar to how Bonnie has a power that doesn't really seem to be from a fruit, it might be instead a product of world government experimentation. So yeah, there's a lot going on, a lot to consider, but there is definitely recurring imagery that's strongly suggesting some sacrifice of a young woman was made, potentially Lily, and in return, the power to grant dreams was given. A few minutes ago, I spoke about pieces of an island coming together to make Jaya, and somehow reforming Joy Boy like that. And we saw something similar in Wano. Although we don't have the details, there seems to be 6 different regions, all brought from other planets places, which is evident by their different climates. But I bring this up again because there is an opposite theory to this. Dak and Randy Troy spoke about this a while ago, and other people have discussed this in relation to the myth of Horus from ancient Egypt, which is that Joy Boy may have been split up into pieces. At first, it might sound ridiculous, however, think about it. The hands of liberation is one thing, right? The Opi Nomi is shaped like a heart, so that could be Joy Boy's heart. We know that Joy Boy's heart gave off the drums of liberation, so maybe each piece of Joy Boy is a different part of liberation, and they were split up, which again is conveyed in the Horus myth, and it does recur in myth. So for anyone thinking this is ridiculous, think about the title of the story, One Piece. One Piece is all about division and unification. So what better way is there for Emu to defeat Joy Boy other than splitting him up like the poneglyphs, and then Joy Boy being reformed by being put together? Okay, but there's two ways of doing this. We could be talking about literal body parts and life force and stuff like that, and if you put them in a blender and blend them all together, Joy Boy pops out. However, the second idea is that rather than Joy Boy having bones and body parts split up and spread all over the world and then brought back together, instead each member of the Straw Hat crew holds a piece of Joy Boy inside them, and by attending Laugh Tale together, all of them pieces come together, which then allows Joy Boy's voice to inhibit the crew. So in other words, each one of the Straw Hats brings a bit of their own personality, which reflects Joy Boy's personality, and as a group, that makes up what Joy Boy used to be. So let's say Joy Boy was a captain, that would be Luffy. Let's say Joy Boy was also a doctor though, then that would be Chopper. Let's say Joy Boy was a shipwright, then Franky, Chopper and Luffy coming together is starting to evoke the old Joy Boy. When Joy Boy is finally fully evoked, then this might be what facilitates the One Piece to truly reveal itself. The island itself might even detect Joy Boy's presence or something like that, the will of the island, right? And some theories discuss the idea that once this happens, some technology is accessible on Laugh Tale. I've discussed the idea of a throne being there matching the empty throne, but this time Luffy sits on it and it powers up the ancient kingdom, perhaps gives him the ability to make dreams come true or create a sun, something ridiculous. But let me know in the comments if you think I've missed any important parts of Joy Boy that would need to be brought together. To finish off, let's discuss a mini theory that just sadly drifted into the ether. Oda might have even abandoned it, but I really hope not. And that is what happened with Big Mom and Kaido. Clearly they were shown to be dropped into lava, but there's a few things that make us think that it's not their full demise. Primarily because they were blasted out like Team Rocket from the side of the volcano, meaning they're not still in there. They're not stuck in there and burnt just to oblivion. Secondly, we have this idea of a massive debt Kaido owes Big Mom because of the whole Devil Fruit situation at God Valley. There was weight added to this as well when we got the God Valley flashbacks revealed, because unfortunately the entire dialogue from Big Mom throughout that whole flashback is just Big Mom going, yeah, you know, I've given you a fruit, or you know, I really want this fruit, and just highlighting the fact that it's important and that Kaido owes her for it. So for that to be unresolved later on doesn't seem like very fitting to me. It seems like there's space to bring particularly Big Mom back, but I guess this is part of the problem with One Piece, right? There's a lot of politics around Whole Cake now. We've got Katakuri, Pudding's been captured. What is going on with the Big Mom pirates? Are they going to Wano to find Big Mom? Are they going to Hachinosu to save Pudding? What's going on with the new leader of the island? If any of you know much about Stroizen, then you would know that Stroizen would not let this lie. Stroizen's a very manipulative, powerful planner. So, but as I say, it's a problem with One Piece. We don't have the time and the exposition to go into this. So I really hope we get something around this, particularly as Big Mom is so deeply connected to Elbaf. Stroizen is also connected to Elbaf. So yeah, as I mentioned in the second part of the Iceberg as well, a giant did see the events of what happened. So Oda seems to have set it up that there's going to be resolution. Whether or not he can actually fit that in the story, I don't know anymore. The pace is just moving too quick, which is gutting, because who doesn't love Big Mom? Who does not love Carmel? Carmel is one of the goats of One Piece, you know, just like Kureha, Higurashi, these evil mountain witches that have a lot going on. And don't forget, Carmel not only had the sorrow fruit, but Carmel used some weird light trick at the execution of the giants, like Fate, God's light on her. So what is going on there? Like, unless Oda gives me something, I'm going to be struggling to sleep at night. So Oda, if you hear this, you know what to do.